Morning everyone. So this video is a teaching overview of week 5 of our Holy Habits series and week 5 of Church at Home. So we've already gone through 4 habits, 4 kind of practices that we do that the church has done for 2,000 years. We've looked at the habit of personal devotion, praying and reading. We've looked at the habit of remembering, or the sacraments and worship and testimonies. We've looked at the habit of gathering that weekly the church has gathered. We've looked last week at the habit of generosity, that the church has served and given, and people have given out of themselves for the benefit of someone else. And this week we actually cover a really difficult topic. We're looking at the habit of self-denial. Now, in a day and age where we are kind of obsessed with self-care, you see those memes, you see those stickers, which are like, take care of yourself, do it for yourself. Have a you day, have a me day, take a me week. Self-care, and for some good reasons, so not knocking it totally, but self-care has become like a really big topic. So the idea of talking about self-denial can be quite controversial in some ways, because why would you want to deny yourself anything? But the church has practiced this habit of self-denial, and by self-denial we mean saying no, essentially saying no to an appetite or a desire, saying no to an appetite or desire, and with a purpose for a greater good. And that is essentially the habit of self-denial, and it is seen probably the most throughout church history and throughout the history of the people of God in 2 practices, which is the practice of fasting, and the church as well as the people of God have regularly practiced the act of fasting, which is self-denial, saying no to food for the purpose of seeking God. And the second practice, which the church has practiced over the ages, is the practice of abstinence, which essentially is the practice of saying no to sex until you are married. It's the practice of putting that aside. And so we want to look at these 2 things very briefly, and we want to look at self-denial very briefly and why it's an important practice or habit for us to engage in. So I think one of the important things to note is that appetites can be unhealthy. And I think we know that you see it in addiction. In addiction is when an appetite can have grown like so overwhelmingly that it controls your life. And sometimes if we say yes to every appetite, every desire, it can lead to unhealth. So I think of myself practically. I used to love those boxes of 6 Woolworths donuts. And, if you like those Woolworths donuts, you know what I'm talking about. And they come in boxes of 6. And I was like, 6 is probably too much for me, and eating 6 donuts is probably not a good thing for anyone's health. But you have 1 donut, and then you have like 5 lonely donuts calling out to you, and then you have another one and another one. And if you don't practice, in one sense, self-denial, if you don't practice the habit of saying no, the discipline of not giving into every desire, if you don't practice that, then what happens is you do like I've done probably more than once, and I'm a bit ashamed to tell you, you've eaten all 6 donuts. And unhealthy, unchecked desires or appetites that we just give ourselves to ultimately leads to unhealthy lives. And the act of self-denial is, in one sense, the act of bringing our appetites, is reining our appetites in so that we can live a healthy life. But more importantly, it's about reining our appetites in and bringing them under the lordship of Christ. It's saying to ourselves that we are not going to be dictated by every appetite that rises from within. We're not going to be dictated by every desire that we have. Sorry. We're not going to give ourselves to those things. We are going to bring every appetite and desire under the lordship of Christ and allow Him to reign. I just want to read a passage because I think this one helps us when we think of fasting. And fasting is probably the most common practice of the church in self-denial. In Mark, we covered this last year, but in Mark it says, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. People came and asked him, why do John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples fast, but your disciples do not? Good question. Jesus said to him, the wedding guests cannot fast while the groom is with them, can they? As long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise the new patch pulls away from the old and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost as well as the skins. No new wine is put in to fresh wineskins. It's an interesting passage because Jesus, mentions that his disciples aren't fasting at the moment because he's with them, but there will be a time when it is right for them to fast. And so there is appropriate moments when it is good for us to fast. And what John Piper says is what this passage seems to be leading at is that part of the habit or the practice of fasting or the practice of self-denial is the practice of denying certain appetites so other appetites can thrive. I.e., sometimes the appetite for food or for sex or for pleasure or for whatever can be so overwhelming in our lives that it kind of masks and takes away from other appetites that should also be thriving. And in particular, we fast to allow the appetite for our desire for God to thrive. Because the reality is that sometimes we mask what's really going on in our lives with food. We mask what's the difficulties, the challenges, the things that we would normally bring to God and engage with God. And we sometimes mask the realities of who we are and what we're dealing with. And even our deep desire for God, we mask it by just feeding the most immediate appetites of food and lust, and we could go on. And so fasting is this practice of actually disciplining ourselves to say no for a period of time to those things so that we can say yes to our desire for Christ. In one sense, Sabbath is a habit of self-denial as well. The practice of saying no to work, saying no to an abundance of activities so that we can say yes for one day to enjoying God. It's the habit, the practice of denying, the practice in one sense of saying no to a whole bunch of things, even some of those things, good things, so that we can say yes to the practice and the desires and the longings of God. And fasting is not just the not eating of food. It could be the stopping of alcohol for a period of time. It could be not eating of meat for time. It could be, as it says in Corinthians, the mutual decision to not have sex for a period of time with your spouse. It could be the discipline of being off social media for a certain time. We know from some people's Lent practice that it could be the practice of stopping certain pleasures like sugar, etc. It could be even for you the practice of not watching TV or Netflix or something for a period of time. And sometimes the act of fasting can even involve not engaging with people. And while this is not, when we're not talking about loneliness here, we're talking about the practice throughout the ages of people withdrawing for a period of time, often for like a day or two, into silence and solitude, just to allow the desires for God to thrive. Now, it's important at this moment just to say that self-denial is not about suffering. It's not about the practice of disciplining ourselves, like whipping ourselves because we feel bad about our sin or something like that. It's not a religious practice to compensate for our guilt or our shame. It's none of that. It is the disciplined practice of the church of cultivating our desires for Christ, our love for God. And sometimes cultivating our love for God requires us to withhold some of the desires that just seem to overwhelm that. such as eating, and Sabbath, such as work. But maybe I can just say this as we close now, as we thought about this, is one of the things that Mark passage seems to say is that there is inappropriate and an inappropriate time to fast. And it seems like what Jesus is saying is that a wedding is an inappropriate time to fast, and probably most of us would agree with that, is that it's not a good time to go to a wedding, a banquet, a feast, joy, dancing, a party, and be the person who is fasting. And so it seems like there are inappropriate and appropriate times to fast. And it seems throughout the Old Testament it talks about them mourning and fasting. So it seems like mourning is more of an appropriate time to fast at times. But I think there's something that Jesus is really getting us to. And this is the idea that when we are with Christ, as his disciples were at that moment, that was an inappropriate time. But then there would be times when they weren't with Christ and that they need to cultivate their desires for Jesus, and that would be an appropriate time. And I think what Jesus is highlighting at this point is he's highlighting the fact that one day fasting will end. One day fasting will end. One day unchecked desires will no longer be a problem. One day we're not going to have the issue of needing to bring our desires and our pleasures and that under the lordship of Christ, because we will be with him. It is the glorious hope of the church that one day we will rise with Christ, we will live with him, and we will live and enjoy the banquet feast of Christ. A beautiful thing. But we are not in that day. We are in the day where we are waiting in hope for that to happen. And as we wait in hope, we go through periods of time where we bring our desires under the lordship of Christ through fasting, through abstinence, through Sabbath, through the disciplines and the habits and the regular practices of the church to bring our appetites and desires under the control of Christ, and to allow our appetites and our desires for Christ to thrive. So this Thursday as a church, Thursday the 8th of February 2024, we are fasting together. We are taking one day, just one day, where we're not going to eat any food until the evening, until after a prayer meeting that we're going to have together on Thursday evening. And I want to encourage all of you to join us, to take one day. It will mean a few meals, a few snacks, a few bits of discomfort. But to take one day and to bring your appetite for food under the reign of Christ and allow your desire for Christ to live and to thrive as you seek him in that day while we fast. So Harbour City, join us on that day, and hope this has been a good day at Church at Home. God bless everyone.